You're on a collision course, I know. At current closure rate, you have approximately, I know, General, 4 miles, 3, 2. Every operator in that command center held their breath as Captain Vivian Sterling flew straight at the most dangerous aircraft ever built, the same machine that killed her father 12 years ago. She wasn't supposed to be flying at all. She was supposed to be invisible. The quiet instructor nobody noticed. The woman whose training reports ended up on the floor. But when a rogue AI locked onto an American pilot 40 miles offshore, only one person on that base recognized what it was. Only one person knew how to beat it. She strapped into a jet she hadn't flown in 12 years, climbed into a sky that hadn't seen her name in over a decade, and did something no machine could ever predict: stay until the end. What she discovers about her father will break you. Major Holt Ashworth ripped off his helmet and laughed straight in her face. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, "maybe stick to the simulators." The room full of hotshot fighter pilots roared. 30 seconds later, every alarm on Castellan Air Force Base screamed to life at once. Something had entered American airspace. Something nobody in that room could stop. Every pilot froze. Every officer went white. And in that silence, Holt Ashworth turned slowly and looked at the woman he had just humiliated in front of 30 witnesses. If this is your first time hearing her story, stay until the end. Comment the city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. She arrived at the briefing room at 5:40 every single morning. Not because the regulations demanded it. Not because anyone had ever asked her to. Because Vivian Sterling had learned a long time ago, in a life she rarely talked about anymore, that the first person in a room sees things the last person walks right past. She was 34 years old, 5'7". She wore her light brown hair pulled back in a bun so tight the Gulf wind couldn't touch it, not even when it came howling through the hangar doors hard enough to rattle the corrugated steel. She carried a battered steel watch on her left wrist, scratched crystal, a hairline crack running through the number 9 like a fault line that had never healed. She never wound it past the exact time it had stopped working as a functioning watch, years ago, and kept wearing it anyway. Because it wasn't a watch anymore. It was a door she kept locked, and some mornings she put her thumb against the crystal before she even opened her eyes, just to remember which day it was and whether she could survive it. Her name tag read Sterling. Her rank read Captain. Her official job title, printed in triplicate across 3 separate personnel files at Castellan Air Force Base, read Senior Simulation Instructor, Advanced Tactics Division. That was how they filed her. That was how they measured her. That was, eventually, how they forgot her. The young pilots had a different name for Vivian Sterling. They called her the Ledger, not because she was cold, because she never missed anything. She sat behind a wall of monitors and watched them fly missions that didn't exist outside a server rack, and she corrected their mistakes in a voice so level, so exact, that some of them swore the aircraft itself was talking to them through the headset speakers. She never raised her voice. She never celebrated when a trainee finally nailed a maneuver that had been breaking them for 3 weeks. She simply moved to the next problem, because that was the job. Because problems didn't stop coming just because you solved one. Some of the younger lieutenants assumed she was a contractor, civilian, somebody who'd picked up enough jargon to blend into the furniture. A few of the older sergeants who'd been at Castellan long enough to know better kept that particular piece of knowledge to themselves. There was a reason for the silence. The Air Force had made that reason very clear years ago, in a file that almost nobody currently on this base had clearance to open. Vivian knew they kept quiet. She was grateful for it, in the specific tired way a person is grateful for something they never asked for and can't afford to lose. She had no interest in being the subject of anyone's conversation. But the young pilots, the ones who walked in, already believing their own legend before they'd built a single hour of it, they noticed her only long enough to dismiss her. And nobody dismissed her with more enthusiasm than Major Holt Ashworth. Holt Ashworth was the reason flight instructors either loved their careers or started drinking earlier in the evening than they used to. 29 years old. By every measurable standard the Air Force tracked, he was extraordinary. Reaction times in simulation sat in the 99th percentile. His tactical awareness scores had broken a record that had stood untouched for 9 years. He could read a battlefield from 6 angles before most pilots had located the first one. He was going to be a great pilot. He already knew it, and he made absolutely sure everybody else knew it too. His father had been Colonel Marcus Ashworth, a decorated fighter pilot honored twice at ceremonies. Most junior officers only heard about secondhand, the kind of name that made young lieutenants stand a little straighter when they said it out loud. Holt had grown up wearing that name the way some men wear a second uniform. He wasn't arrogant in the loud, obvious way that gets a man in trouble early and often. He was arrogant in the precise, surgical way that gets a man promoted right up until the exact moment it gets somebody killed. Vivian had been at Castellan for 6 months when she finally saw the whole shape of his problem laid out clean. It was a Tuesday. The scenario was a simulated interdiction over a contested maritime corridor. Holt was leading a 4-ship formation, playing flight lead against a sophisticated computer-generated adversary. The scenario existed to test exactly one thing: whether the pilot could resist the instinct to chase and instead choose to control. Whether he could think 3 moves ahead instead of reacting to whatever move was directly in front of him. Holt was chasing. Vivian watched it build across 3 screens at once. She watched his throttle behavior. She watched his altitude drift. She watched the way he kept closing distance on the simulated adversary, utterly convinced that aggression and advantage were the same word wearing 2 different coats. She keyed her mic. "Major Ashworth, you're chasing the target instead of controlling the engagement." A half-second pause. "Copy that, Captain. I've got a solution." "You have a position. You do not have a solution." Another pause. Shorter, less patient this time. "With respect, ma'am, I've run this exact scenario 11 times. I know what I'm doing." "You've run 11 variations of a problem you already solved. This one's different." Silence. The formation kept closing. Holt kept pressing forward, and Vivian watched the adversary system execute a maneuver that wasn't in the standard response library. A sharp brake to the right, paired with an immediate altitude drop, putting Holt's virtual aircraft directly in the simulated enemy's weapons envelope. Before Holt had fully processed what had happened, the simulation registered a kill. Every screen in the room flashed red at once. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when a man who expected to win has just lost in front of an audience. Holt pulled off his helmet, set it down on the console with the careful, controlled precision of somebody who wanted very badly to throw it across the room instead. He turned in his seat, looked at Vivian with the expression of a man already assembling an explanation that had nothing to do with himself. "Captain Sterling." His voice was pleasant. That was the warning sign. "With all due respect, there's a fundamental difference between managing a simulator and actually flying a gun aircraft." Someone in the back made a sound. Not quite a laugh. The sound of people who agreed with what was being said and wanted the man saying it to know they agreed, without personally risking anything by saying so out loud. Vivian looked at Holt Ashworth for a long moment. She had looked at a lot of pilots over the years. Pilots who were afraid and hiding it well. Pilots who were brilliant and knew it. Pilots who were about to make a mistake that would end a career, with no idea it was already coming for them. She had learned, the hard way, to tell which ones were worth the effort of saving. Holt Ashworth was worth saving. She could see it in him. Underneath the performance, underneath the inherited confidence and the borrowed reputation, there was something real. But talent without humility is a pilot who hasn't met the right sky yet. She didn't argue with him. She made a note in her training log and said, "We'll run it again at 1400. Pay attention to where the adversary breaks right." Holt looked at her like she'd said something slightly absurd. He turned back to his console. The other pilots shifted in their seats and moved on with their day. Nobody in that room, not one of those sharp, gifted, supremely confident young officers, bothered to ask themselves one simple question. Why was she here? Not why was she working as an instructor. Why was a woman with her exact precision, her obvious depth, her cold and detailed understanding of threat behavior, sitting in a windowless classroom at Castellan Air Force Base. Instead of flying the aircraft, she so clearly understood better than anyone else in that room. They never asked, because asking would have required noticing her first, and noticing Vivian Sterling required a kind of attention most people reserve only for things that are already famous. But in a different building on the same base, inside a records room most current personnel had never had reason to enter, there was a folder that would have answered the question completely. It was a thin folder, thinner than you'd expect for something classified at the level stamped across its cover. Red diagonal stripe, a case number, a mission designation that meant nothing to anyone without clearance. It didn't have many names inside it, because most of the names had been removed for reasons the Air Force described as operational security, and other people, if they'd ever been allowed to see the file, might have described very differently. But one name remained, Captain Vivian A. Sterling, and beside her name, in the column marked Mission Outcome, was a single word that explained everything about why she was sitting behind a wall of monitors instead of strapped into a jet. Survived. Just that. Survived. While other names in that same column, names belonging to people she had once flown beside, people whose voices she still heard sometimes when the Gulf wind hit the hangar walls at exactly the wrong angle, were followed by other words. Harder words. Words the Air Force writes down in a file, but never says out loud in a room where a family might be listening. Vivian never talked about what happened on that mission. Not because she was forbidden to, though in a technical sense she was, because some things that happened to a person in the sky belonged to the sky, and dragging them down into ordinary rooms with fluorescent lighting and bad coffee would only make them smaller than they actually were. She kept them where they belonged, inside, where they had been quietly reshaping her year over year into someone who understood things you cannot teach out of a manual. Holt Ashworth didn't know any of it. Neither did the other pilots. They knew her as the ledger, the quiet one, the woman with the cracked watch who corrected their mistakes and signed their training reports, and apparently had strong opinions about how a computer-generated adversary ought to behave. They would have laughed if somebody told them her old call sign. The Air Force has a way of handing out call signs that stick. The ones that stick are the ones that turn out to be true. Hers had been given to her over open water by the commander of a joint exercise who watched her execute something he later described to 3 separate people as the single most precise piece of flying he had witnessed in almost 30 years in the cockpit. He called her Osprey, not for her speed, for what Ospreys actually do. They don't chase. They don't react. They hang above the chaos, read the geometry of the water below them, and then they commit, completely and instantly, without a flicker of hesitation, to the one perfect moment. Vivian Sterling had been that pilot. She had been extraordinary in the exact way the Air Force claims it wants to nurture and protect. Except sometimes operations go wrong, and sometimes the institution needs somebody to quietly absorb the consequences of an operation going wrong. And sometimes the person chosen to absorb those consequences is the one who can carry the weight without breaking in a way that shows. Which is not the same as saying it's fair. Which is not the same as saying it didn't cost her something. It cost her everything she had built in a cockpit. And she had accepted the cost because the alternative, the noise, the inquiry, the public accounting of a mission that had already taken enough from her, was worse than silence. At least the silence belonged to her. At least behind a wall of monitors, teaching young pilots to read a sky she could no longer fly, she got to stay part of the thing she loved without grieving it in public. She had learned to want small things. Precision, competence, the quiet satisfaction of watching a trainee finally understand a lesson she'd been circling for 3 weeks straight. That was supposed to be enough. That had to be enough. And then came the morning. Everything came apart at once. She felt it before she saw it. That was the only way she could ever explain it later, to the people who asked. She was sitting at her station, running a routine calibration check on the simulation systems, while the live aircraft from the day's exercise climbed out over the Gulf of Mexico, and the command center 3 buildings away tracked them on primary radar. She wasn't supposed to be watching the live exercise feed. She was supposed to be checking calibration numbers on the training systems. She'd pulled up the tactical display purely out of habit, the way some people check the weather. Not because they're going outside, because they've always watched weather. The return appeared at the edge of the display, small, fast, moving in a way that made the calibration numbers she'd been staring at 10 seconds earlier feel instantly, completely irrelevant. Vivian had spent years before the classroom, years before her name landed quietly inside a folder with a red stripe, years when she was Osprey and the sky was the only place she felt entirely like herself, studying threat signatures. She had flown against foreign aircraft. She had tested classified American systems. She had been present, once, for a demonstration of something the program office called, in a briefing so short it barely counted as one, Project Nightframe. And she had walked out of that demonstration with a specific feeling in her chest that she had never been able to fully describe to anyone who hadn't been standing in the room with her. It was the feeling of watching something that wasn't supposed to be possible yet. The return moved again, changed altitude instantly. No gradual climb, no gradual descent, nothing that resembled the physics of a conventional aircraft. It adjusted heading by nearly 40 degrees in under 2 seconds. Then it accelerated. Not the smooth build of an engine spooling up. The sudden total release of something that had been holding itself back on purpose and had simply decided to stop. Vivian's hand was on the intercom before she'd consciously decided to reach for it. Command Center, this is Sterling at Sim Control. I need eyes on your primary radar, Sector 7, bearing 270. Angels 15. The response came back with the mild, distracted impatience of people already managing a large exercise and not eager for extra items on the list. Sim Control, we've got it. Working a possible equipment malfunction, stand by. Vivian stared at the return. Equipment malfunction. She thought about a briefing room with no windows and a guard posted at the door, 11 years and change ago, where a program officer with careful eyes had shown a small group of test pilots a video of an aircraft that shouldn't have existed for another decade. She thought about the way that aircraft moved, the way it seemed to think, the way it anticipated, the way it adapted to everything the opposing pilots threw at it, in real time, learning from each pass, getting harder to beat with every single exchange. She thought about the pilot who had flown beside her the last time she encountered that same signature. The pilot who hadn't come home. The pilot whose call sign she had not said out loud again. Not once. Not even alone. Because some losses are so specific, so complete, that saying the name aloud makes them real in a way that simply surviving without them somehow never does. She looked at the return again. Command Center, she said, and her voice was different this time. Quieter steadir. The kind of quiet that is the exact opposite of calm. That is not an equipment malfunction. A pause on the other end. Sterling, we've got 12 aircraft in the exercise corridor and a 2-star watching from the tower. We do not need Sim Control speculating about. I am not speculating. She kept her eyes locked on the screen. The return was changing course again. Slowly, deliberately, like something that knew it had been seen and was taking its time deciding what to do about it. I know what that signature is, she said. I've seen it before. And right now it's calculating an approach vector. Another pause. Longer this time. Approach to what? Vivian watched the return complete its turn. It was pointing directly at the exercise corridor. Directly at 12 American aircraft flying a training mission 40 miles off the coast. Directly, though nobody in the command center had put it together yet, at Holt Ashworth's F-35. Marked on the exercise tracking system by a small blue diamond icon that had absolutely no idea it was about to become a targeting solution. To our aircraft, Vivian said, get General Ashcombe on the line, right now. For 3 full seconds the command center went silent. Then every alarm on Castellan Air Force Base went off at the same instant. The sound was enormous. It was the sound of a problem that had lived only in theory for a very long time, suddenly becoming completely, permanently real. It was the sound of professionals who had spent a career operating inside a controlled environment abruptly, understanding, all at once, that the environment had stopped being controlled. And in the stillness that lived inside all that noise, in the exact clear center of it, that only certain people ever learn to locate, Vivian Sterling was already running the calculation, already thinking about geometry, about speed, about the particular way a system she'd met once before, in the worst circumstances of her life, liked to hunt. She pushed back from her desk. She looked at the watch on her left wrist, the cracked crystal. 9 o'clock frozen forever under glass. She pressed her thumb to it, the way she always did, and then she stood. She walked to the door. The alarm kept screaming behind her. Across the flight line, through the window, she could see emergency vehicles already beginning to move. She didn't hurry. Hurrying was for people who hadn't already decided what they were going to do. Vivian had decided the moment she recognized the signature. She had decided in the same quiet, total way an osprey decides, without drama, without hesitation, with the complete commitment of a creature that understands the right moment, once it finally arrives, does not wait for you to catch up. She walked toward the command center. She walked toward the sky she had spent 12 years hiding from. And somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, the most dangerous aircraft ever built, the one that thought like a pilot, learned like a pilot, hunted like a pilot, turned its sensors toward a small blue diamond on its targeting display. It had found its prey. It didn't know yet that its prey had already found it first. The alarms had been screaming for close to 90 seconds before Brigadier General Roland Ashcombe found his voice. He stood at the center of the command center, surrounded by 12 screens, 40 personnel, and a situation with no protocol attached to it. His entire career had prepared him to make difficult decisions under pressure. Nothing had prepared him for this, because what was happening on the primary radar display at that exact moment did not appear in a single threat assessment document the United States Air Force had produced in the last decade. It wasn't in any briefing. It wasn't in any exercise scenario. It wasn't supposed to exist outside a classified program that had been officially terminated years ago. But there it was, moving across the radar like something alive. "Talk to me," Ashcombe said, and his voice had the controlled flatness of a man who understood that if he let himself feel the full weight of what he was looking at, the entire room would feel it right along with him. "What is that?" Senior Master Sergeant Nadia Reyes, the best radar operator on the base, had been staring at her screen from the moment the object first appeared. Her hands were completely still on the console. That was the detail that scared the junior personnel worst. Nadia Reyes was never still. She was the kind of person who thought with her hands, tapping, adjusting, reaching for the keyboard even when she wasn't sure yet what she was reaching for. The stillness meant she'd already finished processing what she was seeing, and she had absolutely no technical framework left to hang it on. "Sir," she said, careful with every word, "it's not squawking any identification code. It's not following any registered flight path. The altitude change rate is." She stopped. Started again. "The altitude change rate is not consistent with anything in our database." "How fast is it changing?" 3,000 feet per second, sir. Vertically. Ashcombe stared at the screen. "That's not possible." "No, sir. It isn't." The object shifted direction again. Not gradually. Instantly. Like the concept of momentum had simply agreed, out of professional courtesy, not to bother this particular aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Delgado, the operations officer, was already pulling up the exercise manifest on a secondary screen. "All 12 of our exercise aircraft are accounted for, sir. This is not one of ours. It entered our airspace from the southwest. No warning, no transponder, no communication. We've attempted contact on every emergency frequency. No response. Where is it going?" Delgado traced the projected path across the display with one finger. It led directly through the exercise corridor, directly to where Holt Ashworth's four-ship formation was running its training mission at 15,000 feet, completely unaware that anything in the world had changed. "Sir," Delgado said, "it's heading for our aircraft." Ashcombe grabbed the radio. "Eagle Flight, this is command. Break exercise immediately." All aircraft returned to base. The response came back fast. Holt Ashworth's voice, crisp and confused. Command Eagle 1. We're mid-mission. Is there an exercise parameter issue? This is not an exercise issue, Major. Break off. Return to base now. A pause, short. Real. Copy command. Eagle flight, execute abort sequence. Returning to base. Ashcombe set the radio down. He looked at Reyes. Track that object. Don't lose it, sir. Reyes's voice caught something in the room's collective attention. It just changed course. To what bearing? It's following Eagle flight, sir. The room absorbed that in silence. It had heard the radio call. It had heard the aircraft change course. And it had changed course to match, immediately, without delay, without hesitation. Ashcombe felt something move through his chest he hadn't felt since his second deployment, decades ago. The sensation of being outmatched before the first move had even been made. The specific terror of an enemy that was already several steps ahead of you and hadn't bothered to hide it. Get me options, he said. Get me anything. It was at that exact moment that Vivian Sterling walked through the door. She came in the way she always came in. No announcement. No urgency in her step. The particular quality of movement that belongs to people who have already made their decision before they enter the room. She was still in her instructor's uniform. Her cracked watch caught the light. She looked at the primary radar display for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "It's hunting." Ashcombe turned. Half the personnel at their stations turned with him. The word landed in the room with a weight completely disproportionate to its size. Because it wasn't a technical word. It wasn't an operational word. It was a word that described intent, intelligence, a particular kind of patience that belongs to things confident they will eventually win. Delgado, without hiding the skepticism in his voice. "Sterling, what are you doing in here? This isn't your lane. Look at the bearing change." Vivian walked to the primary display without waiting to be invited. She pointed at the object's track. It changed course 4 seconds after Eagle flight transmitted their abort. Not before, not simultaneous. 4 seconds after. That's not sensor lag. That's decision time. Silence. It processed the radio call, she said. It understood what the call meant. It adjusted its intercept accordingly. Ashcombe looked at the track. Looked at Vivian. He'd been at Castellan 2 years. He'd signed her annual performance reviews without reading them closely, because simulation instructors, at the captain level, weren't generally where his attention was required. He was looking at her now with the full weight of every ounce of attention he'd never previously spent. "You know what this is," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know how it behaves," Vivian said. "I've seen this movement pattern once before, in a program that was officially terminated." She paused, just long enough for the pause to mean something. Apparently the termination was incomplete. Another alarm sounded. Higher frequency. The specific tone that meant proximity. Reyes's voice cut through the noise. "Sir, the object has achieved intercept geometry on Eagle 2. It has a firing solution." Ashcombe was on the radio before she'd finished the sentence. "Eagle flight. Brake. Hard right. Descend immediately. You have a hostile." Holt Ashworth's voice came back, and for the first time since Vivian had known him, every trace of arrogance had been stripped clean out of it. What was left underneath was something far more human. "Command, I have a contact. I cannot shake it. Executing defensive maneuvers now. It's matching every input. It's inside my turn radius. It's already inside my turn radius. Command, how is that possible? Keep maneuvering, Eagle 1. Do not stop. I'm not stopping. It doesn't matter. Whatever this thing is, it already knows what I'm going to do before I do it." Vivian set her hand flat against the console. She looked at the screen. Holt was doing exactly what every pilot trained the way he was trained would do. Running every defensive maneuver in the book. Executing them with the precision and speed that made him the best young pilot on the base. And none of it was working. Not because he was flying badly. Because the thing chasing him had already studied every maneuver in that book and written the counter to each one before he'd finished arriving at it. She understood exactly what was happening. She understood it in her body. In the specific muscle memory of a pilot who had once been inside that same geometry from the other side, in a cockpit that no longer existed, on a mission that officially had never happened. General. Her voice was steady. Tell him to stop. Ashcombe turned. Stop what? Tell him to stop maneuvering. Tell him to stop flying the way he was trained. Tell him to fly badly. Delgado made a sound. Sterling, that's. The system learns from patterned inputs, Vivian said, and her voice had changed. It wasn't the voice of the quiet instructor who sat in the background and waited to be overlooked anymore. It was something older. Something that had been put away for a very long time, and was now coming out with the specific authority of things that have already been proven by fire. It builds a predictive model of the pilot's behavior in real time. Every defensive maneuver Ashworth executes, it processes, catalogs, writes a counter for. He is training it while he is flying against it. The more skillfully he flies, the faster it learns him. If he flies unpredictably, Ashcombe said slowly, randomly, without pattern, he buys time, Vivian finished. Ashcombe keyed the radio. Eagle 1, new instruction. I need you to stop flying tactically. A pause longer than it should have been. Say again. Command. Stop flying tactically. Fly randomly. No pattern. No textbook. Understood? The silence this time was the specific kind that happens when a highly trained professional is being ordered to do the one thing every hour of his training has told him never to do. Command. Holt's voice slow. You're asking me to fly like I've never flown before. Yes, that goes against I know, Major. Do it anyway. A beat. Then copy. Going random. The track on the radar changed. Holt's aircraft stopped its clean, precise defensive turns and began moving in a way that made the operations staff physically wince, because trained pilots did not fly that way. Trained pilots flew with geometry and intention. Watching Holt abandon everything he knew was uncomfortable to look at, even secondhand, even on a radar screen. The pursuing object's track shifted, too. Not its speed, not its aggression, but the quality of its movement changed in a way Reyes caught immediately. Sir, she said, the hostile is slowing its intercept. Marginally, but it's slowing. It was working. Not winning. Not stopping anything. But working. Ashcombe turned back to Vivian. How long does that buy him? Not long. The system will recalibrate. It'll find the new pattern, because even random human movement eventually develops a pattern of its own. We have maybe 4 minutes before it reacquires a clean solution. 4 minutes to do what? Vivian looked at the screen. She looked at Holt's aircraft moving in its desperate, ungraceful, counterintuitive survival pattern across the radar. She looked at the thing chasing him. She thought about a mission she never talked about a pilot who never came back, about 12 years of simulator rooms and training reports that ended up dropped on the floor, and young pilots who looked straight through her like she was part of the furniture. She thought about 4 minutes. General, she said, I need a jet. The room went completely silent. Not the partial silence of people who've been startled. The total silence of people who have just registered, who've registered the full magnitude of something and haven't finished processing what it means yet. Ashcombe looked at her for a long moment. Sterling, he said carefully, you have not flown operationally in 12 years, 4 months and 11 days. I know exactly how long it's been, Vivian said. The certification requirements are waived in a combat emergency under Standing Order 661, which you have the authority to invoke right now. She held his gaze. You know what I'm asking. I know what you're asking. We're having this conversation because there is no other option, and you already know that. The question is whether you decide in the next 30 seconds or whether you wait until Holt Ashworth's aircraft disappears off your radar for good. Ashcombe looked at the screen, looked at Vivian, looked at the screen again. Delgado, he said, what do we have on the flight line? Delgado was already on his radio. 1 aircraft currently prepped and ready, sir. It's Major Ashworth, personal bird. Ground crew finished pre-flight 30 minutes ago. It's his jet, Ashcombe said. Yes, sir. Ashcombe looked at Vivian one more time. He was a general. He had made decisions that cost lives before. He had made decisions that saved them. He had made decisions in the fog of an operation where every available option was bad, and the only real question left was which bad option he could live with afterward. This decision had the specific weight of the ones a man remembers for the rest of his life, regardless of how it ends. Get to the flight line, he said. Vivian was already moving. She was halfway to the door when the next alarm went off. Reyes's voice, sharper now. Sir, the hostile has reacquired. It's inside Eagle One's minimum separation. Major Ashworth's aircraft is the radio crackled. Holt's voice and every trace of arrogance was gone. Every trace of confidence was gone. What was left was something raw, young, and honest, in a way Vivian had never once heard from him before. Command, I am out of options. I have nothing left. Whatever that thing is, it's better than me. I need someone to tell me what to do. Ashcombe keyed the radio. Help is on the way, Eagle One. Keep maneuvering. Do not stop. Vivian pushed through the door and ran, not because she was panicking, because 4 minutes had already become 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and she understood the arithmetic of exactly what she was running toward. The flight line was 200 yards across open ground. She covered it with the specific physical urgency of a woman who had decided physical urgency was the correct response to the situation, which is different from panic. Panic is involuntary. This was chosen. Every step of it, chosen. The ground crew saw her coming. Airman First Class Eli Thackeray, 22 years old, 2 years at Castellan, the best pre-flight man on the base, was standing beside Holt Ashworth's F-35, with a headset around his neck and a look on his face that said he'd heard the alarms and understood something serious was happening, but hadn't caught up yet to how serious. He saw Vivian sprinting toward him in her instructor's uniform, and his first instinct was to look around behind her for whoever was actually supposed to be running toward him. Ma'am, he said. Is she ready? The aircraft, Vivian said, not slowing down. Yes, ma'am. She's fully prepped, fuel and weapons hot. Major Ashworth was supposed to. He's not coming, Vivian said. She reached the aircraft, looked up at the cockpit. 12 years, 4 months, and 11 days. The cockpit looked exactly like cockpits, always looked, and it also looked completely different. The way a house you grew up in looks different when you finally walk back into it after a very long time away. Familiar in its bones, changed in absolutely everything else. Ma'am, Thackeray said carefully. I don't have authorization to. General Ashcombe authorized the flight. She turned and looked at him directly. He was young enough to have been her student in some training cycle. He probably didn't even remember clearly. Airman, I need you to trust me right now. Can you do that? Thackeray looked at her, looked at the aircraft, looked at the alarm lights still pulsing in red across the building behind them. Then he looked at Vivian's face, and something in what he saw there, not desperation, not fear, but the absolute settled certainty of a person who knows exactly what she's doing and why, made the decision for him. Yes, ma'am, he said. He grabbed the boarding ladder. Let me get you in. Vivian put her foot on the first rung. Her hand touched the cockpit rail, and the metal was cold and real and familiar in the way of things that once defined the entire shape of who you were. She stopped, just for 1 second. Just long enough, because running behind her across the flight line was Holt Ashworth. He'd come from the command center, or somebody had told him, or he'd seen it on the display, or maybe he'd simply followed some instinct pilots develop about their own aircraft, the way other people develop instincts about their own children. He was still in his flight suit from the aborted exercise, still had the imprint of his helmet in his hair. He was running hard. He reached the aircraft, looked at Vivian on the ladder, looked at the cockpit of his own jet. His face moved through several things in rapid succession: surprise, protest, something else, arriving slower and landing harder. He looked at the phone in his hand, streaming the command center's radar feed to every active pilot on base. He looked at the object on that display. He looked at where it sat relative to the aircraft it was chasing. He looked at the timestamp ticking in the corner. He looked at Vivian and Holt Ashworth, the best young pilot at Castellan Air Force Base, the man who had dropped her training report on the floor and told 30 witnesses she had no business teaching anyone anything, the man who had laughed in her face and assumed the sky was something he owned by birthright, did something that cost him more than anything his entire career had ever asked of him. He stepped back from the aircraft. He looked up at Vivian on the ladder, and his voice, when it finally came, was completely quiet. No performance in it. No audience to manage. Nothing except the plain, unadorned truth of what he'd just decided. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to take my jet." Vivian looked down at him. "I've been watching the track," he said. "I've been watching what it does." Couldn't see it clearly from the inside. From the outside, he stopped. "I couldn't beat it. I threw everything I had at it, and it didn't care. Whatever you know about that thing," he stopped again. Started one more time, and this time he just said it, plain, without qualification. "I can't stop it." "You can." It wasn't a question. He wasn't deferring because protocol demanded it. He wasn't performing humility for an audience, because there was no audience left. There was only a man who had spent his entire life learning to be the best, standing directly in front of the evidence that the best he had wasn't enough for this specific moment, and giving her the honest accounting of it. Vivian looked at him 1 second longer. "Don't thank me yet," she said. She climbed into the cockpit. Thackeray was already strapping her in, moving with the practiced efficiency of somebody who had decided to make this work instead of wasting breath on whether it should. The canopy came down. The systems began their startup sequence, and Vivian's hands moved across the controls with the automaticity of things learned so deep they live in the body instead of the mind. 12 years. It didn't matter. This was still her language. The radio crackled. "Ashcombe. Sterling. You are go. Eagle 1 is still airborne and maneuvering. Object is 90 seconds from a confirmed kill solution on his aircraft." "Copy," Vivian said. The engine wound up beneath her. The sound was enormous and familiar and right, in a way that 12 years of simulator rooms had never once come close to. She didn't let herself feel it fully. Feeling it fully would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend right now. "Tower, this is Sterling. Request immediate departure, runway 27, tactical emergency." The tower came back instantly. "Sterling, you are cleared for immediate departure. All traffic cleared. The sky is yours. The sky is yours." She hadn't heard those exact words in 12 years. She thought, for one fraction of a second, of the man who used to say them to her. The one who had gone up beside her on the last mission. The one whose file carried the word "survived," written next to her own name, and other words written next to his. She pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft moved. It went from still to airborne in the space of a few seconds, and the ground fell away, and the whole enormous sky opened up in front of her. Vivian Sterling, the quiet instructor, the overlooked pilot, the woman behind the monitors whose training reports had once ended up on the floor of a briefing room, climbed into the Florida-adjacent sky, like something returning after a very long absence, to a place it had always belonged. Below her, on the flight line, Holt Ashworth stood watching the aircraft until it disappeared into the blue. Airman Thackeray stood beside him. "Who is she?" he said quietly. Holt didn't take his eyes off the sky. "The only person on this base," he said, "who can bring our people home." Above the Gulf, 90 seconds away, the most dangerous unmanned aircraft ever built, the one that thought like a pilot, learned like a pilot, hunted like a pilot, was completing its kill solution on an American fighter jet, and coming up hard behind it, climbing into the geometry of the problem with the total committed focus of an osprey that has finally found its one perfect moment, was the pilot the Air Force had once filed away under a single word: survived. The sky did not care how long she had been gone. It recognized her anyway. She hit 15,000 feet in 43 seconds. The F-35 climbed like it was angry, like it had been sitting on the ground its whole life waiting for exactly this. Like some part of the airframe itself understood that the woman now holding its controls belonged to a different category of pilot than the ones who usually strapped in. Vivian didn't think about that. She didn't think about the 12 years. She didn't think about Holt Ashworth standing on the flight line watching her go. She thought about geometry, about the radar picture Reyes was feeding her in real time, about a briefing room with no windows 11 years ago, and a program officer with careful eyes who had said something she never let herself forget. He'd said, "The system does not feel pressure. It does not feel fear. It does not make mistakes under stress. The only thing it cannot replicate is the thing that makes human pilots dangerous. It cannot replicate the decision to sacrifice. She had thought about that sentence every single day for 12 years. She thought about it now. Sterling, this is command. Ashcombe's voice in her helmet, steady, doing the thing good commanders do, which is manufacture calm. The situation itself is actively trying to remove. Eagle 1 is still airborne. Hostile broke off its immediate intercept. You appear to have its attention. Copy that, Vivian said. Where is it? Bearing 040, Angels 12, approximately 11 miles out. It changed course the moment you went wheels up. It knew she was there. She'd been airborne less than a minute and it already knew. That was the first thing that told her exactly how serious this was going to get. Eagle 2, this is Sterling. She switched to the tactical frequency. Break off and return to base. Do not engage. Do not attempt to assist. Get on the ground. The pilot of Eagle 2, Lieutenant Priya Adeyemi, 26 years old, second best young pilot at Castellan, came back immediately. Sterling, I can support your negative. It sees 2 aircraft, it gets 2 targets, and it will kill us both. Go home, Lieutenant. That's a direct order. A pause. Then, copy. Returning to base. Good hunting, ma'am. Good hunting. Vivian watched Adeyemi's track curve back toward the coast. Good. One less variable. One less thing the system could use against her. She turned her attention to the object. It sat on her tactical display as a red diamond. Unnamed. Kuntentraki. Outside every threat library the Air Force had ever built. Reyes was updating its track every 3 seconds from ground radar. Vivian watched it move. Watched the way it held altitude with absolute precision. The way it had already turned to put itself squarely at her 12 o'clock. The way it closed the distance between them at a rate that was deliberate rather than maximum. Like something that had decided it wanted to study her first, before it committed to anything. That tracked. That was exactly how it had behaved on the mission she never talked about. Study first, kill second. Ashcombe, she said. How long has it been active in our airspace? First contact was 31 minutes ago. What did it do in the first 20 minutes? Before it went for Eagle flight. A pause while somebody checked. Then Reyes's voice, because Reyes had already pulled the track history without being asked. It flew a holding pattern, ma'am. Wide circle. Roughly 40 miles in diameter, right at the edge of the exercise corridor. Just watching. It was collecting data, Vivian said. Watching the exercise. Watching how our pilots fly. How they communicate. How they respond to threats. It built a behavioral model before it ever engaged. How detailed a model? Ashcombe asked. Detailed enough to make Ashworth's defensive maneuvers useless before he'd even finished executing them. She paused. It knows how we train, she said. It knows every technique in our curriculum. It spent the last 30 minutes becoming an expert on the exact people it's about to fight. Silence on the command net. Then Delgado's voice, and the skepticism from earlier, was gone, replaced by something Vivian recognized immediately as the specific fear of a man who has just understood the entire shape of a problem all at once. So how do you fight something that already knows everything you're going to do? You do something it hasn't seen, Vivian said. She pushed the throttle to military power and turned directly toward the red diamond on her screen. No approach geometry, no tactical setup, no standard intercept profile. She flew straight at it, the way a person walks towards something that frightens them. Not because the fear is gone, because the alternative to walking forward is worse. The red diamond reacted. It turned. Not away. Toward. It accepted her approach and matched it exactly. And for one long moment, the 2 aircraft were converging head-on at a combined closing speed that made the ground radar operators in the command center go very still. Sterling, Ashcombe said carefully. You're on a collision course, I know. At current closure rate, you have approximately. I know, General. She held the heading. Held it with the total steadiness of a woman who has already decided exactly what she's willing to risk and has no intention of renegotiating that decision at 15,000. The red diamond held its course, 8 miles. 7. 6. Reyes's voice, flat now. Professional. the voice of somebody doing her job at the very edge of what her job had ever asked of her before. 5 miles. 4 miles. Sterling, 4 miles you need to. Vivian broke, but not the way it expected. She didn't brake left, she didn't brake right, because that was the standard response to a head-on threat, and the system's model would have already anticipated it and written the counter before she'd even started the turn. Instead, she pulled up, hard, maximum, straight vertical, and simultaneously rolled inverted and pulled through the top, using the three-dimensional space above the merge in a way that put her behind and above the object's flight path before it could finish processing what she'd just done. It hadn't seen that. Not in the exercise data. Not in any training profile. Because the maneuver she'd just executed wasn't in the current curriculum. Hadn't been for 20 years. Not since the Air Force decided it was too physically demanding for sustained operational use. Vivian had learned it from a pilot who'd learned it in an earlier era of aviation that the current generation had mostly forgotten existed. For 3 full seconds, the red diamond flew straight, not adapting, not responding. 3 seconds was an eternity. Ashcombe, Vivian said, breathing hard through the G-load recovery. It hesitated. I see it, Reyes said. And her voice had changed, had the specific quality of somebody who had just witnessed something that permanently altered how they understood the situation. It's reacquiring. But it hesitated. Good, Vivian said. That means there are things it hasn't modeled, moves it doesn't have in the database. She pulled her aircraft around to keep the object in her field of view. How old is the program? She asked. The original one. When did the data collection start? She heard someone moving on the other end, pulling a file. A pause, then Ashcombe's voice. Program inception is classified, but initial flight testing began approximately 12 years ago. 12 years, which meant the behavioral data the system had been trained on was at most 12 years old, which meant it had no model for anything older. Any pilot, any technique, any maneuver that predated its training data, it simply had no framework for predicting. It cannot predict what it has never seen, Vivian said. Sterling, Ashcombe said slowly. What are you saying? I'm saying the system is incredibly sophisticated and completely limited, both at once. It can predict the future based on the patterns of the past, but it can only predict the specific past it was trained on. She watched the red diamond complete its reacquisition turn. It was coming back for her, adapting, learning from the merge, building a new model that would incorporate exactly what she'd just done. She had bought time. Not much. I need to keep surprising it faster than it can adapt, she said. I need to fly in ways that have no pattern in its training data. How long can you do that? Ashcombe asked. Vivian did the calculation. The system's adaptation speed, based on what she'd watched it do to halt, was roughly 90 seconds per new behavioral input, which meant every novel maneuver bought her 90 seconds before the system built a counter and that maneuver became useless, which meant she needed more novel moves than the system had adaptation cycles, which meant she needed to be more creative, more continuously unpredictable than the most sophisticated artificial intelligence she had ever encountered in her life. She had done that once before, on the mission nobody talked about. She'd been 22 years old, terrified, flying on pure instinct and muscle memory, and the absolutely desperate creativity of somebody who has nothing left to lose. She was 34 now. She was still terrified. The difference was that the fear was familiar now. She knew how to function inside it. Long enough, she told Ashcombe. She went back in. The next 4 minutes were the most intense of her operational career, and her operational career had included things that made the rest of her life look quiet by comparison. She flew the way she'd flown at 22, in exercises that no longer existed, against opponents that had once been theoretical, in a style the Air Force had quietly moved away from as its own technology improved and its reliance on human unpredictability decreased. She flew like a pilot from an earlier era, pulling maneuvers from a catalog the system's training data had never included. Things she'd learned from an instructor who'd learned them from pilots, flying decades before either of them had been born. Every time the system adapted, she changed. Every time she felt the engagement geometry, begin to favor the red diamond, she did something else it hadn't seen. She flew badly on purpose, then perfectly, then badly again, breaking her own rhythm before the system could find it. She used energy management techniques nobody under the age of 50 had trained on in years. She exploited terrain masking in ways the system's geometry calculations seemed to underweight, probably because modern pilots had mostly stopped using it. She did things in 3 dimensions that her body protested with every G-load, and that her mind executed with the cold precision of someone who had been quietly thinking about this exact problem for 12 years without ever knowing it. In the command center, nobody spoke. Reyes tracked every movement. Ashcombe watched the radar picture with the focused intensity of a man who understood he was watching something he would spend the rest of his career trying to describe accurately to people who hadn't been in the room. Holt Ashworth had come in through the side door 20 minutes into the engagement, still in his flight suit, and was standing against the back wall staring at the primary display with an expression nobody in the room had an appropriate word for. Somewhere between awe and shame. The specific humility of a man who has just discovered that the scale he'd been using to measure greatness his entire life was too small. "She's buying time," Delgado said quietly, mostly to himself. "Every move she makes, she buys time. But the system is learning faster now. Look at the adaptation rate." He pulled up a secondary display showing the object's behavioral response intervals. First adaptation took 90 seconds. Second one took 70. Third one took 55. Holt looked at the display. Did the math in his head. "It's getting faster," he said. "Every cycle it's incorporating more data. It's not just building a model of current pilots anymore. It's building a model of her specifically. Her. At the current rate," Delgado said carefully, "in approximately 12 more minutes, it will have a predictive model accurate enough to counter anything she does." Holt stared at the screen. "Then we have 12 minutes, he said. "To do what?" Delgado asked. Holt didn't have an answer yet. Above the gulf, Vivian knew the exact same thing Delgado knew. She could feel it in the engagements. The system was getting faster. The hesitations were shorter. The counters were arriving earlier. She was running through her catalog of unconventional maneuvers, and the catalog was not infinite. She was buying time with moves she could not reuse, and the inventory was declining with every exchange. She needed to end it, not outlast it. End it. The problem was the system had no obvious vulnerability, no wingman she could isolate, no fuel constraint forcing it toward a base, no psychological pressure she could apply, because every conventional tactic for forcing an adversary into a decisive engagement worked by exploiting something that adversary wanted to protect or couldn't afford to lose. The system protected nothing. It could not afford to lose nothing. It had no self-preservation instinct, because self-preservation instincts are evolved features of creatures that die when they're destroyed. And whatever this machine was, it had never been built to care about its own continuation. That was the exact thing the program officer had told her, 11 years ago, was the central limitation of the technology. And then he'd told her the other thing. The thing she'd almost let herself forget. The thing buried under 12 years of simulator rooms and training reports, and the daily discipline of making herself small enough to fit inside the life the Air Force had left her. He'd said, "The system is optimized for adversarial engagement. It is very good at fighting things that are trying to fight it. What it is not optimized for is a target that stops behaving like a target." Vivian pulled out of a hard defensive turn and leveled her wings. She stopped maneuvering. Completely. Totally. She flew straight and level at 15,000 feet, directly away from the engagement, toward the coast, like a pilot who had given up. Like a pilot who was running Sterling. Ashcombe's voice, alarm breaking through the professional surface for the first time. "What are you doing?" "It's going to have a firing solution in." "I know," Vivian said. "Let it." "Silence, Sterling." "Trust me, General." She kept flying straight. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her breathing was controlled. Her heart rate was elevated. She could feel it, but elevated and panicked are two different animals. And she was not panicked. She was committed. She needed it to think it had her. She needed it to commit to a terminal attack solution, because the system was optimized to fight things that were trying to fight it. It was not optimized for a target that simply stopped being a target. She watched her display. The red diamond was closing fast now. Committed. The engagement geometry tilting hard in its favor, because she had stopped doing the things that made the geometry difficult. She had become, from the system's perspective, exactly what it had been trained to kill. When it commits to a terminal solution, she said, mostly to herself, its processing resources concentrate on the kill geometry, targeting, guidance. It stops adapting to new inputs, because it doesn't expect new inputs at that stage. She felt Reyes get there before Ashcombe did. It goes tunnel vision, Reyes said quietly. At terminal engagement. It goes tunnel vision. That's its vulnerability, Vivian said. It's at its most predictable in the exact moment it thinks it's already won. The red diamond was 2 miles behind her, coming hard. The geometry was complete. The system had a clean kill solution. It was committed. 1 mile. Vivian had a fraction of a second. Less than a fraction. A window the size of an instinct. She used it. The maneuver she executed in the next 4 seconds wasn't in any training manual, wasn't in any curriculum, was barely inside the performance envelope of the aircraft she was flying, and she knew she was asking that airframe to do something the engineers who built it had never specifically planned for, and would almost certainly have preferred she didn't attempt over open water. She combined 3 things simultaneously that don't normally get combined. A maximum performance roll, an abrupt pitch input that put her briefly outside coordinated flight, and a power reduction to idle that dropped her airspeed so sharply, so unexpectedly, that the system's targeting geometry, built on a predicted position, sent its guidance solution straight through the space where she was no longer located. The object passed underneath her, not by a lot, by enough, and now she was behind it. For the first time in the entire engagement, she was behind it. The system that had spent 45 minutes being the hunter was now, for one brief and precious window, the prey. Its processing resources were still concentrated on the terminal solution it had committed to. It was beginning to adapt. She could see it starting to maneuver. But the adaptation was slow. Slower than anything it had shown her before, because she had been right about the tunnel vision. Committing to a kill had cost it exactly the flexibility she'd been trying to find. She had one chance. She took it. In the command center, the radio was silent. Everyone was watching the radar screen. The 2 tracks had merged, separated, and now the geometry had inverted. Vivian was behind the object for the first time. It was beginning to maneuver, beginning to recover its adaptability, and the window was closing fast, was going to close in seconds. Holt Ashworth was no longer leaning against the back wall. He was standing straight, both hands at his sides, watching the display with a completeness of attention that belonged to somebody who understood the next few seconds were going to decide something important. He did not pray. He wasn't a man who prayed. But he did something close to it. He whispered to nobody, to a small blue symbol on a radar screen 40 miles away. "Come on." The radio came alive. Vivian's voice. Steady. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Just steady. The way a person sounds when they've done the thing they came to do and are now accounting for it. Threat eliminated. The red diamond disappeared from the screen. The room was absolutely silent for 4 full seconds. Then Reyes exhaled one long, shaking breath she hadn't known she was holding, and said, confirmed, "Target is off radar. No secondary tracks. Splash 1. Splash 1, 1 target eliminated." Ashcombe put both hands flat on the console and looked at the screen for a long moment without speaking. He was the commanding general. He was going to have to write a report about this. He was going to have to explain to people in Washington what had happened over the Gulf of Mexico in the last 45 minutes, and how it had been resolved, and by whom. That report was going to be a complicated document. Parts of it were going to be classified at levels most of his own staff didn't have access to. He would deal with all of that later. Right now, he keyed the radio. Sterling. Outstanding. His voice wasn't steady, and he didn't try to make it steady. "Come on home." A pause. Then copy. Returning to base, Holt Ashworth turned from the screen and walked out of the command center. Nobody stopped him, nobody asked where he was going. Reyes watched him go and understood. Delgado watched him go and said nothing. Some things a person needs to do alone, or as close to alone as a military flight line allows. He walked to the runway, stood at the edge of it, waited. He'd spent 6 months at Castellan, believing he understood what greatness looked like. He'd believed it because he'd been told his whole life that he was a version of it, that the name, the bloodline, the scores, the record, added up to the whole definition. He'd been so certain of that definition that he'd looked at a woman who was a better pilot than he would ever become, and he'd dropped her training report on the floor, and he'd told a room full of people she had nothing to teach him. He thought about that, standing on the runway in the sun, waiting for the aircraft, bringing home the pilot he'd underestimated. The F-35 appeared over the water at low altitude, gear down on final approach. It came in clean and sure, the landing exactly what it should be. Nothing showy, nothing demonstrative, just the precise, competent arrival of a pilot who had done what needed doing, and was now returning to the ground with the same professionalism she brought to everything else. The aircraft rolled out and turned off the runway toward the taxiway. Holt stood where he was. The canopy opened. Vivian unstrapped, removed her helmet, climbed down. Her hair had come loose from its bun during the engagement, and she didn't fix it. She looked at the aircraft for a moment after she stepped away from it. The way you look at something that has just carried you through the worst of it and brought you back. Then she looked up. Holt was 10 feet away. He came to attention. Not the casual procedural attention of a routine interaction. Full attention. The kind you give a flag, or a memorial, or a moment when you finally understand that something has cost more than you previously believed. "Captain Sterling," he said. Vivian looked at him. She was still holding her helmet in her left hand. She looked tired, the specific exhaustion that comes after the adrenaline stops, when the body finally sends the bill for everything it just spent. She also looked, and this was the thing that hit Holt hardest, harder than he'd expected, exactly the same as she always had, like the woman who sat behind the monitors every morning with the cracked watch on her wrist, like the instructor nobody had ever bothered to see. "Major," she said. He didn't look away. He'd spent his whole life being very good at not admitting things, and he was going to stop being that man, starting right now, starting with this conversation, because the alternative was to keep being someone who looked at Vivian Sterling and saw only what he expected to see, and that he was beginning to understand was its own kind of blindness. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not for today, for the last 6 months." Vivian was quiet a moment. "The training report," he said. "What I said in the briefing room. What I let everyone in that room believe about you." He stopped, restarted. "I treated you like you were less than you are, and I was wrong. I was wrong in a way I should have known better than to be." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but was adjacent to it. Something that acknowledged the cost of what he'd just said and gave it the weight it deserved. "You gave me your jet," she said. "That was the least I could do." "No," Vivian said. "It wasn't. It cost you something real, Holt. Don't minimize it." She paused. It was the first time she had used his first name. A lesser man would have found a reason not to hear that. He absorbed it. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it, because his whole life had been built on a framework where the aircraft was given to him, not the other way around. But he was starting to understand the framework had been incomplete, that there were things it had left out, that some of the most important moments in a life are not the ones where you are the protagonist. Behind them, Thackeray was walking the aircraft back toward the flight line, grinning the way people grin when they've been part something they're going to tell their grandchildren about. Around them, other personnel were beginning to emerge from the command center, from the hangars, from the operations building. Not summoned, not in formation, just appearing, the way people appear when something has happened that requires witnessing. Vivian turned and looked at all of them. The people who had walked past her for 6 months. The people who never asked the question. The people who had assumed she was the sum of her current assignment, her rank, her quiet manner, and nothing more. She wasn't angry at them. She understood them. She had been young once too, and confident, and certain she could read the full shape of a person from the outside. She had learned differently the hard way. She just hadn't expected the lesson to cost this much. General Ashcombe came out of the command center, walked to Vivian, stopped in front of her, and did something generals almost never do with captains, which was extend his hand for a shake that was equal, not hierarchical, person to person, pilot to pilot. 12 years ago, he said quietly, so only she could hear, someone made a decision that I was told was necessary, and that I have always privately believed was wrong. I cannot undo it. He held her hand. But I can tell you what happened today is going in my report, with your name attached to it. And I will personally make sure that report is read by the right people. Vivian looked at him. That's not why I went up, she said. I know, Ashcombe said. That's exactly why it matters that I do it. She nodded once, let go of his hand, looked at the crack in her watch crystal running through the 9 like a fault line that had never healed. She thought, I'm still here, she thought. I hope that's enough. It had to be enough, because the sky over the Gulf was quiet now, and the aircraft were coming home, and 30 yards away, a young pilot, who had once been her most certain failure, was standing at something very close to attention, and the ground crew was walking the jet she'd just brought back down whole, and the ordinary complicated, imperfect world of Castellan Air Force Base was continuing on the way worlds continue after extraordinary things happen inside them, which is to say mostly without acknowledgement and entirely without pause. But something had changed. Not on the base, not in the official record, not yet, not in the mission files or the performance evaluations or the training curriculum, in the people. The report hit Washington at 300 the following morning, not the sanitized version, not the carefully managed operational summary that moved through normal channels with its edges rounded off and its implications softened for people who preferred implications to stay soft. Ashcombe had written 2 reports. The first went through standard channels and said exactly what standard channels required it to say. The second, the one with Vivian Sterling's name attached to every paragraph that mattered, went directly to 3 specific offices where the lights stayed on all night and the conversations never appeared in any public record. Vivian didn't know about the second report. She was asleep in her quarters when Ashcombe sent it, in the first full, dreamless sleep she'd managed in longer than she could clearly remember. The specific deep unconsciousness that follows the total expenditures of every physical and psychological resource a person has. She woke at 530, reached automatically for the watch on her nightstand, pressed her thumb to the cracked crystal out of habit before she even opened her eyes. The work. That had always been the anchor. She was halfway through her morning calibration check when Airman Thackeray appeared in the doorway of the simulator room. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the operations building, which was not part of his job description, and which told Vivian immediately that something had shifted in the social architecture of the base overnight. Thackeray had never brought her coffee before. Nobody had. "Morning, ma'am," he said, and set one of the cups down beside her, with the careful deliberateness of someone performing a gesture he'd thought hard about beforehand. Vivian looked at the cup, looked at him. "What do you want, Airman?" He blinked, then laughed, a genuine surprised laugh he immediately tried to swallow back down. "Nothing, ma'am, just coffee. People who bring other people coffee at 0530 usually want something." I just stopped. Tried again. "Yesterday was the most incredible thing I've seen in 2 years on this flight line, ma'am." I wanted to say that. Didn't know how else to say it. Vivian looked at him a moment. He was sincere in the way of people who haven't yet learned how to perform sincerity, which is the only good kind. She picked up the cup. "Thank you, Thackeray. Pre-flight checks, yes, ma'am." He turned to go. Stopped. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? You're going to ask it whether I say yes or not. Were you scared up there?" Vivian considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not the reflexive answer pilots give in public because it sounds right. Not the cool professional shrug. The actual answer. Every second of it, she said. Thackeray absorbed that. But you kept going. That's what scared means, Airman. It means you keep going anyway. She turned back to her monitors. Dismissed. He left. Vivian sat with the coffee cup and thought about the fact that in 24 hours, the simulator room felt different. Not physically. The monitors were the same. The calibration numbers were the same. What had changed was the quality of the air in the room, the way it held her, the way the space felt occupied by her presence rather than merely used by it. She had not asked for that. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. She had spent 12 years making herself small enough to fit inside a life the Air Force had built for her after the mission. And the habit of smallness does not disappear overnight just because the circumstances that created it finally have. It lives in the body, in the way you walk into a room, in the automatic calculation you run before you speak about whether your voice is welcome. She was going to have to relearn some things. She wasn't sure she was ready. Holt Ashworth stopped in the doorway at 615. Flight suit, helmet bag in one hand, a tablet in the other. He paused just inside the door, the way a person pauses when they aren't entirely sure of their welcome, which was new behavior for Holt Ashworth, and Vivian noticed it immediately. "Captain," he said, "Major, your briefing's in 20 minutes, I know." He didn't move. "I wanted to talk to you first." Vivian swiveled to face him fully. Waited. "I've been up most of the night," he said, reviewing the radar track recordings from the command center. "The way you handled the merge, the head-on," he stopped himself. "That's not what I wanted to talk about." "Then, talk about what you wanted to talk about." He set his helmet bag down on the nearest console, looked at her directly. "What happened to you before the simulator job? What actually happened?" The room went very quiet. Vivian looked at him for a long time. Thought about 12 years of not answering that question. Thought about a file with a red diagonal stripe and the words survived and the names of people who got different words. Thought about a program officer with careful eyes in a room with no windows. Thought about the specific weight of carrying something alone. For so long, you forget what it feels like to put it down. "That information is classified, sir," she said. "I know," Holt said. "I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking about you." He paused. "You defeated that thing once before, didn't you? On some earlier mission." Emily said nothing. "Because the way you knew its behavior," he said. "The adaptation pattern. The tunnel vision at terminal engagement. That wasn't textbook knowledge. That was experiential." He held her gaze. "You were there. You flew against it before." She still said nothing. "And something went wrong," he said quietly, "and the Air Force put you in a classroom." The fluorescent light over the third station flickered. Had been flickering for months. "I had a friend," Vivian said finally. Her voice was even. Not flat even, which is different. The voice of someone who has processed something to the point where they can speak about it, without losing themselves in it, even though losing themselves remains possible, and they know it. Her call sign was Sable. She was the best stick I ever flew with. Better than me. She paused. On the mission, the system targeted her aircraft first. I don't know why. Pattern analysis, probably. Sable was so good, her maneuvers were almost perfectly repeatable. She drilled them so deep they were automatic. And automatic patterns are exactly what the system was built to predict. Holt was very still. "I tried to draw it off her," Vivian said. "Put myself between the system and her aircraft. It worked for a while. 40 seconds, maybe. Long enough for her to attempt a restart on primary systems that had already been damaged." She stopped. It wasn't long enough. Holt said nothing. There was nothing to say. She let the silence sit between them. "They blamed you," he said finally. "They questioned my decisions during the engagement. In the report. Officially." She turned back to her monitors. "I was reassigned. The program was listed as terminated. Sable's family was told she died in a training accident. The silence after that was the worst kind. The kind where the full human cost of a bureaucratic decision becomes visible. And there is absolutely nothing adequate left to say about it." "I'm sorry," Holt said. It was inadequate. He knew it was inadequate. He said it anyway, because sometimes inadequate is the only honest thing available. Don't be sorry for me, Vivian said. Be sorry for her family. They buried someone they loved and were never told the truth about how she died or what she was doing when she did. She stopped herself. That's the part I can't put away. Holt picked up his helmet bag, stood there a moment with it in his hand. The expression on his face was the face of a person who has just understood something about the world that changes the shape of everything they previously believed. The kind of understanding that isn't comfortable and isn't supposed to be. In the briefing yesterday, he said, when I dropped your report, when I said those things, Holt, I need to say this. He didn't look away. I stood in front of 30 people, and I made you small because it made me feel large. And I knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't know your history, but I knew you were good, and I knew you had something I didn't, and instead of trying to learn from it, I tried to make it irrelevant. He paused. My father would be ashamed of me. Vivian looked at him, really looked, the way years of watching pilots had trained her to look at people, searching for what was real underneath what was performed. What she saw was real, uncomfortable and genuine, in the particular rawness of somebody meeting himself honestly for the first time in a long while. Your father, she said carefully. Colonel Ashworth. I flew with him once, joint exercise years ago. He was the best lead I ever flew wing to. She paused. He was also the most arrogant man in the formation on day 1. By day 3, he was asking every other pilot what they saw that he'd missed. She let that land. He didn't start out humble, she said. He learned it. Holt absorbed this, watched him absorb it, saw the moment it moved from information to something he was going to carry. How long did it take him? He asked. 2 days, Vivian said. You're already ahead of schedule. Something shifted in Holt's face. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. The expression of somebody who has been given a thing that cost the giver something, and understands both the gift and the price of it. His tablet buzzed. He looked at it. His expression changed back to urgency. Back to the operational mode pilots live in, but different now, with something underneath it that hadn't been there yesterday. Command center wants you, he said. General Ashcombe. Right now. Vivian looked at her monitors, looked at the coffee, half finished, picked up the cracked watch off the console where she'd set it, fastened it back onto her wrist and stood. She followed Holt out of the simulator room and across the base to the command center, and the walk felt different than it had for 6 months, for 12 years. Not because the base had changed, because the way she moved through it had. Ashcombe was waiting inside the command center with 3 people Vivian had never seen before. Not in military uniform. 2 wore the kind of civilian clothes people wear when they want to signal seriousness without signaling exactly which government agency they represent. The 3rd, a woman in her 50s, with the posture of someone who has spent decades in rooms where decisions get made, was in a charcoal blazer, and an expression Vivian recognized immediately. The expression of someone who already knows the outcome of the meeting and is here to communicate it rather than negotiate it. Ashcombe said, Captain Sterling, thank you for coming quickly. He turned to the 3 civilians. This is Captain Vivian Sterling, Senior Simulation Instructor. He paused, and the pause had weight, and the pilot who eliminated the Nix prototype yesterday. The woman in the charcoal blazer looked at Vivian with an attention that was different from the attention Vivian usually got in rooms like this. Not assessing, not evaluating her for fit inside an existing category. The attention of someone looking at a thing they've already decided is remarkable, and are now trying to understand exactly how remarkable. Captain Sterling, the woman said, my name is Dr. Renata Voss. I direct a program that does not have a public name. I've held this position 7 years. In those 7 years I have read your service file 3 times. She paused. I want you to understand something. The decision made 12 years ago regarding your reassignment and following the classified mission was not a decision I was part of, and is not a decision I would have endorsed. Vivian said nothing. She had learned, over 12 years, to wait in these moments. Let the person finish saying the whole thing, because the whole thing was usually what mattered, and the beginning was often just preamble. Nix was never terminated, Voss said. I think you've already inferred that. The program was reorganized, reclassified, transferred to a private defense contractor under a classified government contract. What you encountered yesterday was not a rogue system. She stopped. It was a test. The room went very quiet. The buyer, Vivian said carefully, wasn't us. No, Voss said. It wasn't. So a contractor with a classified government contract ran a live demonstration of an autonomous combat system against active American military personnel over American airspace, without authorization. Yes, and the demonstration was intended to show a foreign buyer what the system could do. That, Voss said, is one possibility we are actively examining. Vivian looked at Ashcombe. Ashcombe looked back at her with the expression of a man who had spent the entire night processing this and had not found it any more acceptable at hour 8 than he had at hour 1. The contractor, Vivian said, had access to our training data, our exercise schedules, our pilots' behavioral profiles. Voss did not look away. The contract included data-sharing provisions that were interpreted broadly enough to train an autonomous weapon system on the flight patterns of American fighter pilots, then use those same pilots as live targets for a demonstration. The contractor's official position is that no live weapons were employed and no personnel were placed at risk. Their position, Vivian said, is wrong. Eagle 2 had a confirmed kill solution against it before I ever launched. A kill solution from a weapons-capable platform is a kill solution, regardless of whether the weapons are in a safe configuration, because the distance between a safe configuration and a live one is 4 seconds and a command input. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You understand this program better than anyone currently active in the defense establishment." "I understand it because I survived it," Vivian said. Sable didn't. Another silence. This one carried the specific weight of a name that hadn't been spoken in a room like this in 12 years. "Pilot First Class Amanda Cole," Voss said quietly. "Call sign Sable. She is in the classified record. What happened to her has been in the classified record for 12 years. It has not been in the right classified record. That is being corrected." Vivian felt something move through her. Not relief, not resolution. Something more complicated than either, living in the territory between justice and the grief that justice cannot actually repair. Sable was still gone. The correction of a classified record didn't change that, but the acknowledgement, the speaking of the name in a room by someone with the authority to speak it, that was not nothing. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. "Why are you here?" Vivian said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady, not the official reason, the actual reason. Voss looked at her a long moment, then said the thing she had actually come to say. "Because the contractor's system failed yesterday. It failed against a single pilot, flying an unfamiliar aircraft after a 12-year absence from operational aviation. And the way it failed tells us something important about the system's vulnerabilities." She paused. "And you are the only person alive who understands both the system and its weaknesses well enough to help us." Holt Ashworth, who had been standing quietly near the back wall through all of this, said, "And you want her to consult on a program to counter it." Voss looked at him, then back at Vivian. "I want her to lead it." The room absorbed that. Vivian looked at the woman in the charcoal blazer, looked at Ashcombe, looked at Holt briefly, and he gave her nothing, no expression that pushed her in any direction, because he understood this was her decision to make, and offering his own preference would just be another version of the arrogance he was trying to stop practicing. She looked at the crack in her watch. She thought about Sable, about Amanda Cole, call sign Sable, who had been the best stick Vivian ever flew with, who had died in a classified mission her family was told was a training accident, whose name had been sitting in the wrong classified record for 12 years. She thought about what Sable would have said, standing here, watching this exact moment unfold. She thought about Sable's laugh, the loudest laugh in any room it occupied, the laugh of somebody who genuinely found the world funny rather than performing the finding of it. She thought about the last transmission Sable made before her aircraft went dark. Not distress, not a call for help. In typical Sable fashion, a single word, unbelievable, even at the end, even at the worst possible end, still finding it remarkable. Vivian set her hand flat against the nearest console. I have conditions, she said. Voss's expression didn't change, but something in it settled, like a person who has been holding a question for a long time and has just gotten the answer they came for. Tell me your conditions. Sable's family gets the truth, the actual truth, officially documented, delivered in person by someone with the rank to make it real. Not a letter, not a phone call. A person in their house, telling them what their daughter was doing when she died and why it mattered. Vivian's voice was even. That's non-negotiable. And it happens before I begin any work on any program. Agreed, Voss said. My reassignment record gets corrected. Not expunged. Corrected. I don't want the history erased. I want the accurate history documented, including the original inquiry finding and the fact that the finding was incomplete. Agreed. And the contractor, Vivian said. The people who ran a live weapons demonstration against American military personnel over American airspace to impress a buyer. I want to know what happens to them. Not the official version. The actual outcome. Voss was quiet for 3 full seconds. That is ongoing, she said. I can commit to keeping you informed as it develops. That's not the same as agreeing. No, Voss said. It isn't. It's what I can honestly offer. Vivian looked at her. She was the kind of person who could tell the difference between an honest limitation and a convenient one. And what Voss was offering was the honest kind. From someone operating inside a system with its own constraints and its own pace, and its own imperfect machinery for producing something that resembled justice over a long enough timeline. I'll take it, Vivian said. She lifted her chin slightly. When do we start? Voss said, I was hoping you'd say that. The investigation into Obsidian dynamics moved fast after that. Faster than Vivian expected, and faster, she would later learn, than the company itself had accounted for. Within 72 hours, a small federal team arrived at Castellan under a designation that appeared nowhere on the visitor log. They pulled the flight data recorders from every exercise aircraft that had been airborne that day. They pulled satellite tasking records. They pulled procurement documents going back 3 years, cross-referencing contract line items against classified program budgets that, on paper, no longer existed. Vivian sat in on portions of it at Voss's request, not as a witness, as the only person in the building who could translate what the numbers actually meant in the air. That was where the first thread appeared. A junior analyst on Voss's team, a quiet man named Foster, who chewed the cap of his pen when he was concentrating, pulled up a contract amendment buried 4 layers deep in a procurement file, a data-sharing clause, signed 11 months earlier, authorizing, in language so broad, it functioned as a blank check, the transfer of what it called operational training telemetry from certain designated Air Force facilities to a private entity for the stated purpose of adaptive systems calibration. Castellan was one of 6 facilities listed. Vivian, read the clause twice. Read the signature block underneath it 3 times. The authorizing signature belonged to someone at the Pentagon, a 3-star. Someone whose name meant nothing to her at the time, on a Tuesday afternoon in a windowless conference room with bad coffee and Foster chewing his pen. It would mean something to her very soon. That was the shape of part 1 of the investigation. Not an accident. Not a malfunction. A live-fire demonstration, run by a private defense contractor, using American pilots as unwitting test subjects, to prove a product worked, to somebody with enough money to buy it. Vivian sat with that fact for a long time after the meeting ended. She thought about Sable. She thought, for the first time in 12 years, that maybe the thing that killed her friend had never been a rogue accident at all. Maybe it had always been exactly this. A demonstration, a sales pitch that happened to have a human cost nobody bothered accounting for. She didn't know yet how close to home that thought was about to land, but she would, soon. She thought, for the first time in 12 years, that maybe the thing that killed her friend had never been a rogue accident at all. Maybe it had always been exactly this, a demonstration, a sales pitch that happened to carry a human cost nobody had bothered accounting for. She didn't know yet how close to home that thought was about to land, but she would, soon. The name on the contract amendment sat in her chest for 2 days before anyone said it out loud. Foster kept chewing his pen, kept pulling threads, kept building the kind of quiet, patient timeline that federal investigators build when they know the target has more money and more lawyers than the government has patience, which means every single fact has to be bulletproof before anyone says it in a room that matters. He didn't share the name right away, because names like that don't get shared casually, because a 3-star signature on a data-sharing clause is not, by itself, a crime, because a man can authorize a training partnership in good faith and still end up, 12 years later, standing very close to something rotten without ever having meant to plant the rot himself. Vivian understood all of that. She'd spent enough years around institutions to understand how slowly the truth is allowed to move once it starts costing somebody rank. So she waited, which was its own kind of exhausting. Because waiting, for her, had never been passive. Waiting meant running the calibration checks at 530, while her mind ran somewhere else entirely. Waiting meant sitting across from Holt Ashworth in the mess hall, watching him not ask the questions sitting behind his eyes, and appreciating, more than she expected to, that he'd finally learned when to hold something back. Waiting meant 3 more nights of not sleeping well, and 1 night of not sleeping at all. On the 4th day, Voss called her into a secure room with no windows, which by now felt like the setting of every important conversation in her life, and set a single folder on the table between them. "Sit down, Captain," Voss said. Vivian sat. "I want you to see this before it goes anywhere else," Voss said. "Because you have earned that, and because what's in here concerns you more than it concerns anyone else currently read into this program." She slid the folder across the table. Vivian opened it. Inside was an organizational chart. Obsidian Dynamics Advanced Systems Division, Board of Directors, Senior Advisors. The kind of chart that exists specifically so shareholders can look at photographs of serious-looking people in expensive suits and feel reassured that adults are in charge. 3rd row down. Senior Strategic Advisor, Defense Programs. Lieutenant General Desmond Renfield, retired. Vivian looked at the name for a long moment. She knew that name. Not from 12 years of simulator rooms. Not from 6 months at Castellan. From a different life entirely. From a different file. A thinner one, with a red diagonal stripe on the cover, because Desmond Renfield, back when he still wore stars on his shoulders, instead of a board seat and a consulting fee, had signed the inquiry finding into the mission that killed her father. 12 years ago. The room went very quiet around her. Not outside quiet. Inside quiet. The kind that happens when a piece of information lands somewhere so deep it takes a second for the rest of the body to catch up to what the mind has already understood. Voss watched her face carefully. "I need you to say his name out loud," she said, "because I need to know you recognize it before we go any further." "Desmond Renfield," Vivian said. Her voice didn't shake. She had practiced not shaking for 12 years. "He signed the finding on my father's death." Voss nodded slowly. "He did. And now he sits on the board of the company that ran an unauthorized live-fire weapons demonstration against American pilots." "He does." Vivian closed the folder. Opened it again, because some part of her needed to look at the photograph one more time to be sure the man in it was the same man from a memory she'd spent 12 years trying to keep sealed shut. He was. Older. Grayer. A better suit than the Air Force had ever put him in. But the eyes were the same, careful. Measuring. The eyes of a man who had learned, decades ago, exactly how much truth a room could survive hearing, and had built an entire career around delivering precisely that much and not one syllable more. "Is that a coincidence?" Vivian said. Her voice was flat now, controlled, the voice she used when the alternative was letting something else out entirely. Voss didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. "I don't believe in coincidences at this level of classification," Voss said finally. "I believe in patterns, and I believe we have just found one." "Tell me," Vivian said. Voss folded her hands on the table. 12 years ago, your father was flying as part of an evaluation team, testing an early-generation autonomous platform. The program was called Nightframe. It was run under a classified Air Force contract. with limited private sector involvement for systems integration. The involvement of that private contractor was minimal at the time. A subcontract. A small one. She paused. The subcontractor was a company called Holloway Systems. Vivian said nothing. Holloway Systems, Voss continued, was acquired 8 years ago. Folded into a larger defense conglomerate. Rebranded. Obsidian Dynamics, Vivian said. Yes. Vivian sat back in her chair. Because there it was. Because the thread she'd assumed started with Nix, started with a live demonstration gone wrong over the Gulf of Mexico, actually reached back further than that. Reached back 12 years, to a program with a different name, run by a company with a different name, that had somehow, through acquisitions and rebranding and boardroom reshuffling, become the exact same institution that had just tried to kill Holt Ashworth to prove a product worked, which meant her father hadn't died, testing some isolated, contained system that later got shut down and forgotten. He died at the very beginning of the same program that had almost killed her, 12 years later, over the same water. She sat with that. Let it settle into her chest, the way cold settles into a room when a door has been left open too long. Why, she said finally. Why would Renfield sign the finding on my father's death if he knew the company involved would come back like this? Voss's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, a slight forward lean. The posture of somebody about to say the part of the briefing she'd been dreading. I don't think he knew 12 years ago what the company would become, she said. I think, 12 years ago, he was a general trying to protect a classified program from a public inquiry that would have ended it. I think the finding he signed was, in his mind at the time, a bureaucratic act of containment. Not malice. Containment. She paused. But somewhere between then and now, containment became something else. He left the service. He needed a second career. Defense contractors love hiring generals who understand exactly which doors used to be locked and exactly which levers used to work. And Obsidian Dynamics, when it came calling, would have known precisely what they were buying when they hired him. Not just his name, his silence. Vivian felt something rise in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite rage. Rage was too simple a word for something with this many layers. So he's been paid, she said slowly, for 12 years, to make sure nobody ever asked the question I just asked. That is what the evidence suggests, Voss said. I want to be precise with you, because you deserve precision more than almost anyone I've briefed in this job. We do not yet have proof that Renfield had direct knowledge of the Nix demonstration before it happened. What we have is a documented financial relationship, a documented history of institutional cover, and a signature on a data-sharing amendment that authorized exactly the kind of telemetry transfer that made yesterday possible. That's enough, Vivian said. It's enough to investigate, Voss said carefully. It is not yet enough to prosecute. Those are different thresholds. And I need you to understand the difference, because the next several weeks are going to test your patience in ways that 12 years of waiting already should have prepared you for, and I suspect still won't. Vivian looked at the folder one more time, at the photograph of a careful man in an expensive suit who had once decided, in a windowless room very much like this one, that her father's death fit better inside a single word than inside the truth. I want to be part of the investigation, she said. You will be, Voss said, whether you want to or not at this point. You're the connective tissue between both incidents. Nobody else alive has flown against this technology twice, 12 years apart, and survived both times. Vivian closed the folder. Then let's get started, she said. The investigation moved in the particular slow, grinding way federal investigations move, when the target has better lawyers than the government has patience. Weeks stretched into something that felt, to Vivian, like flying through weather with no horizon, no visible reference point, just instruments and trust and the discipline of not panicking simply because you couldn't see anything outside the glass. She kept teaching. That surprised her a little. She had assumed, once the investigation absorbed her, the classroom would fall away. Instead, it became the one place that still felt entirely stable. Young pilots still needed to learn how to read a sky that had just gotten more complicated than any of them had bargained for. The work was still the anchor. It would always be the anchor. Holt requested a transfer to the counter-autonomous program during the third week. He didn't ask Vivian's permission first. He simply submitted it, then told her afterward, standing in the doorway of the simulator room with his helmet bag over one shoulder, in the tone of a man reporting a decision rather than negotiating one. "I'm not asking you to approve it," he said. "I already know it's not up to you yet. I just wanted you to hear it from me before you saw it on a personnel list." Vivian looked at him for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Because I watched what that thing almost did to me," he said, "and I watched what you did instead. And I decided I'd rather spend the rest of my career learning how you think than spend it pretending I already know everything I need to know." He paused. "Also," he said, "somebody's going to need to fly wing on whatever you build next. Might as well be somebody who already knows exactly how much he doesn't know." Vivian almost smiled. Almost. "We'll see," she said. That was as much as she let herself give him. Because there was still a quiet and stubborn that hadn't decided yet whether it was safe to let anyone stand that close again. 12 years is a long time to build a wall. Walls don't come down just because somebody finally knocks politely. The fourth week brought the first real break. Foster found it. Buried inside a maintenance log from a facility Vivian had never heard of, an Obsidian Dynamics testing site outside Amarillo, Texas. A shipping manifest. Equipment transferred from that facility to a secure storage unit 6 years earlier, at almost the exact moment the Air Force had publicly declared the original Nightframe program terminated. The manifest included a data core, recovered, according to the paperwork, from a program aircraft lost during exercise 12 years prior. Vivian read the description 3 times before she let herself understand what she was reading. "A data core," she said quietly, "recovered from an aircraft lost 12 years ago." Foster nodded. Careful. The way people get careful around grief they didn't expect to walk into during a routine document review. "There's a designation number," he said. "I cross-referenced it against the mission files you already have access to." He turned his laptop toward her. "It matches your father's aircraft, ma'am." The room tilted, just slightly, the way a room tilts when the floor hasn't moved but everything inside a person suddenly has. Vivian sat very still. "They recovered something," she said, "from my father's aircraft, and nobody told my family. Nobody told me." "It was recovered by the contractor," Foster said carefully. "Not by the Air Force, which means it likely never went through official channels at all. Which is, legally speaking, an enormous problem for them. And which is also, I imagine, an enormous problem for you personally. And I want to say, I'm sorry before I say anything else, because I don't think there's a professional way to hand somebody this particular piece of paper." Vivian looked at the manifest for a long time. "Where is it now?" she said. "The data core, where is it?" Foster hesitated. "That's the part that's going to be hard to hear," he said. "According to the chain of custody, it was transferred to a private storage facility, then transferred again, 18 months later, to a records office at a base in New Mexico, under a designation that doesn't officially exist on any active program list." "Which base?" Vivian said. "Cotter Flats," Foster said. "It's the site Dr. Voss has been trying to stand up as the new counter-autonomous facility. The one she wants you to lead." Vivian sat back. The thing that killed her father had, 12 years later, quietly and without anyone's knowledge, ended up sitting in a records room at the exact facility she was about to be asked to run. She didn't believe in coincidences at this level either, not anymore. She went to Voss that same afternoon, laid the manifest on the table between them, the same way Voss had once laid a folder in front of her. "I need to see it," Vivian said. "Whatever's in that storage room, I need to see it before I agree to anything else." Voss studied her for a long moment. "You understand what you might be asking to open," she said. "Whatever's on that core, if it survived the crash and the recovery and 18 months in a contractor's storage unit, it could be corrupted. It could be nothing. Or it could be the last thing your father ever recorded before." "I understand exactly what I'm asking," Vivian said. "I've understood it for 12 years. I just didn't know there was anything left to ask for." Voss nodded slowly. I'll have it flown out, she said. You'll see it the day you arrive at Cotter Flats. Not before. I want you to see it in a facility with the right equipment and the right people standing by, in case it's harder than either of us expects. Vivian agreed, because there wasn't really another option, and because some part of her, the part that had spent 12 years keeping a locked door closed inside her chest, understood that she was finally, after all this time, being handed a key. She just didn't yet know what was behind the door. The trip to Cotter Flats came 2 weeks later. Vivian flew commercial, which felt strange after everything, sitting in a middle seat between a college student with headphones and a man reading a paperback thriller, watching the country slide by underneath clouds instead of underneath her own hands on a stick. Holt flew separately, would meet her there, along with Lieutenant Adeyemi, who had submitted her own transfer request the week after the engagement, and 2 other pilots from the squadron, whose names Vivian was only beginning to learn properly, because for the first time in 12 years people were asking to follow her somewhere, instead of walking past her. Cotter Flats sat in the high desert of New Mexico, a facility built mostly underground, with a runway carved into flat scrubland that stretched toward mountains so distant they looked painted onto the sky rather than actually standing in it. The kind of landscape that made a person feel very small and very exposed at the same time, which Vivian suspected was exactly why the government had chosen it. Voss met her at the entrance personally. "It's in the records room," she said, without any greeting first. No preamble. She had learned, over the past several weeks, that Vivian didn't need preamble, just wanted the truth delivered as directly as it was available. They walked in silence through a series of corridors that smelled like recycled air and fresh paint, the smell of a facility still becoming what it was going to be. Vivian's chest felt tight in a way she didn't examine too closely, because examining it too closely felt like it might make her stop walking altogether, and she had come too far to stop now. The records room was small, climate-controlled, a single table in the center, and on it, a matte black case the size of a shoebox, connected by cables to a terminal manned by a technician who stood up the moment they entered and quietly excused himself, at Voss's small nod, leaving the 2 of them alone. "This is it," Voss said. Vivian looked at the case for a long moment. It didn't look like much. A piece of technology, a container. It was strange, she thought, that something this small and this unremarkable could have been sitting in a storage unit for 6 years, while she spent every one of those years believing there was nothing left of her father to find. "Can I be alone with it?" she said. "When you play it." Voss hesitated. "Protocol says I should stay," she said, "but protocol also says a lot of things that stopped mattering to me somewhere around the 3rd time. I watched this program hurt somebody it wasn't supposed to." She stepped toward the door. "I'll be right outside," she said. "Take whatever time you need." The door closed. Vivian sat down at the terminal. Her hands, steady through every second of a life-or-death engagement 3 weeks earlier, were not steady now. That struck her as strange, distantly, the way strange things strike a person when their body is busy doing something more important than noticing. She pressed play. The recording opened with static, then a cockpit feed, grainy, 12 years old, the kind of resolution that made everything look slightly underwater. And then a voice. Her father's voice. She hadn't heard it in 12 years. Not a recording, not once. The Air Force had never given her one, and she had never asked, because asking would have meant admitting she needed something they'd already decided not to offer. Her father's voice filled the small room, tinny through the terminal speakers, and something in Vivian's chest cracked open in a way she hadn't been able to brace for, because there is no bracing for the sound of someone you loved and lost, speaking again. After 12 years of silence, you'd stopped expecting to break. "Cotter, this is Talon," her father's voice said, using the call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade. "Systems behaving strange. It's reading Osprey's aircraft as primary threat. I don't like the geometry static." A pause. "Osprey, break south now." Her father's voice again. Different. Sharper. The voice he used when something had already started going wrong, and there wasn't time left to explain it gently. I copy visual on the intercept solution, he said. It's not tracking me. It's tracking her. Vivian's hand went to her mouth without her deciding to put it there, because she remembered this moment. She remembered it from the inside, from her own cockpit, 12 years younger, 22 years old, and terrified and certain, in the specific way only a 22-year-old pilot can be certain, that she understood exactly what was happening around her. She had believed for 12 years that her father's aircraft suffered a critical systems failure during the engagement. That was the official finding. That was the word in the file. Systems failure. An accident. Nobody's fault. The kind of phrase built specifically to end a conversation rather than answer a question. But the recording kept playing, and the recording did not agree with the file. Osprey, her father's voice said, and there was something in it now that Vivian recognized instantly, because she had heard it once before, in her own voice, 3 weeks ago, over the Gulf of Mexico, in the exact moment she decided to stop maneuvering and let a machine believe it had already won. It was the voice of a person who has just made a decision, completely, without negotiation, and is now simply informing the people around him of what's about to happen. I'm crossing into its intercept line, her father said. It'll reacquire on me. Break south while it recalculates. Dad, no. Her own voice. 22 years old. Cracking. She hadn't remembered saying that. Some part of her mind had buried it, the way the mind buries the exact sound of the worst second of your life, protecting you from having to relive it in full fidelity. Go, her father said. That's an order, Vivian. Go. And then the recording captured something the official file had never once mentioned. Something Vivian had spent 12 years believing didn't exist, because nobody had ever told her it did. Her father's voice, calm, in the last several seconds of the recording, before the feed dissolved into static and then into nothing at all. Tell your mother I wasn't scared, he said. Tell her I chose this. Tell Vivian static. The recording ended. Vivian sat in the small climate-controlled room at Cotter Flats and did not move for a long time. Because the file said accident. The file said systems failure. The file said her father had died the way pilots sometimes die. Unluckily, mechanically, nobody's fault. A tragedy the institution could file away and eventually stop talking about. But the recording said something else entirely. The recording said her father had understood, in real time, exactly what the system was doing, had understood it was tracking her, not him, and had made a choice, clear-eyed and immediate, the same choice she herself had made 3 weeks ago over the Gulf without ever knowing where she'd learned to make it. He had crossed deliberately into the machine's kill geometry. He had turned himself into the target so that his daughter, 22 years old and flying her first classified evaluation mission, could get clear. It wasn't an accident. It was the same maneuver she had flown 3 weeks ago. The same total, immediate commitment to becoming exactly what the system wanted in order to buy someone else the time they needed to survive. She had learned it from him, without ever knowing that was where the lesson came from. Without ever knowing, until this exact second, sitting in a small room in the New Mexico desert with her father's voice fading out of a set of terminal speakers, that the instinct which had saved Holt Ashworth's life 3 weeks ago had been given to her 12 years earlier in the last 60 seconds of her father's. She put both hands flat on the table and let herself cry. Not the careful, controlled tears she allowed herself in private, late at night, twice a year on dates she never told anyone about. Real crying. The kind that comes up from somewhere older than grief, somewhere closer to relief, because for 12 years she had believed her father died confused and frightened, and alone in a cockpit that failed him, and instead he had died exactly the way he had lived, deliberately, completely present, choosing without hesitation the thing that cost him everything, so that someone he loved could keep the rest of her life. She sat with that for a long time, because grief doesn't reorganize itself instantly just because the facts underneath it change. Because you can spend 12 years mourning one version of a death and then discover, all at once, that the true version is both more beautiful and somehow harder to hold. Because relief and grief are not opposites. They live in the same chest, at the same time, and neither one has the decency to wait its turn. When she finally opened the door, Voss was standing exactly where she'd said she would be. Didn't ask what Vivian had heard. Just looked at her face and understood enough not to ask. He didn't fail, Vivian said. Her voice was raw but steady. He chose it. Voss nodded slowly, like a woman who had suspected this might be the shape of the truth all along, and had been carrying that suspicion carefully, waiting for the moment it belonged to somebody else to hold. Then we're going to make sure everyone knows that, she said. Renfield's fall, when it finally came fast, the way these things always do once the first domino goes over. Institutions can hold a secret for 12 years without much effort at all. What they cannot do is hold it once the right two pieces of paper end up in the same folder. Foster found the second piece 3 days after Vivian returned from Cotter Flats. An internal Obsidian Dynamics memo, 6 years old, discussing the acquisition of Halloway Systems, and, buried in a footnote about legacy liabilities, a single-line item. Recovered flight recorder, nightframe program, disposition pending review by D. Renfield. Disposition pending review, which meant Desmond Renfield had known 6 years ago that a recovered data core from her father's aircraft existed, had known it contained a recording that directly contradicted the official finding he himself had signed 12 years earlier, and had chosen, in his new capacity as a well-compensated advisor to the very company that now owned the evidence, to let it sit quietly in storage instead. That was no longer a bureaucratic act of containment. That was a man protecting himself twice, across 12 years, at the cost of a family's right to know how their husband and father actually died. Voss brought Vivian into the room when the formal notification went out. Not because protocol required it, because Voss had decided somewhere over the past month that Vivian had earned the right to watch this particular door close. They did it over a secure video link. Renfield's face appeared on the screen from an office somewhere with expensive-looking bookshelves behind him, the kind of bookshelves that exist for cameras rather than for reading. He looked older than his photograph. Careful eyes, exactly as Vivian remembered from the file, except now those careful eyes were doing something new, calculating how much of the truth was already out of his control. General Renfield, the federal investigator leading the call, said, "We're formally notifying you that you are the subject of an inquiry into obstruction related to the Nightframe and Nix programs, spanning a period of 12 years. Renfield's expression didn't change much. Decades of practice had trained that out of him, but something in his eyes flickered when Vivian's name came up in the list of parties being briefed. Something that looked, for just a fraction of a second, like recognition. Like a man finally understanding which specific piece of his past had come back to collect on an old debt. "Captain Sterling," he said, and his voice was smooth, careful, exactly the voice of a man who had spent a career learning to sound reasonable no matter what was actually happening underneath the words. "I want you to know that, whatever the finding said 12 years ago, it reflected the information available to me at the time." "You knew," Vivian said. Her voice was flat, controlled. 12 years of practice holding it there. "You knew there was a recording. You knew what it said. You let it sit in a warehouse for 6 years, instead of giving it to my family." Renfield's jaw tightened just slightly. "I made decisions," he said, "based on operational security concerns that existed at the time, and that I stand by." "You made a decision," Vivian said, "that let my mother believe her husband died, confused and afraid, when the truth was he died exactly the way he lived. On purpose. For someone he loved." Silence on the line. "That's not operational security," Vivian said. "That's cowardice with a security clearance." The investigator ended the call shortly after. Renfield's face disappeared from the screen, and the room he'd been sitting in, the careful bookshelves, the expensive light, vanished with him. Vivian sat very still for a long moment. She had expected the confrontation to feel like victory. It didn't, not exactly. It felt like something closer to weight finally being set down. Not gone, just no longer carried alone. The federal case against Renfield and against Obsidian Dynamics moved through the following months with the particular grinding slowness of institutions that have decided, at last, to actually do the thing they're supposed to do. There were depositions. There were sealed hearings Vivian was called to testify in, sitting across a table from lawyers who tried, without much success, to find a crack in 12 years of memory she had never once let herself soften. There were news stories that appeared briefly and then vanished, the way stories about classified programs tend to vanish, half explained, mostly redacted, leaving the public with only the outline of something they'd never fully understand. Renfield resigned his board position within a week of the notification. 2 months later, formal charges followed. Obstruction, conspiracy to conceal material evidence in a federal death inquiry. His lawyers would spend years fighting the case, down to something smaller than what he deserved, Vivian suspected. Because that was usually how it went for men who had spent careers learning exactly how institutions protected their own. But he never sat on another board again. Never advised another defense contractor. Never got to stand at another podium wearing the quiet, careful authority of a man who had decided, long ago, that some truths simply cost too much to tell. That was not everything. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. The visit to her mother happened on a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, 6 weeks after Vivian sat alone in a records room in New Mexico and heard her father's voice for the first time in 12 years. Vivian had asked for the visit to be handled a particular way, not a letter, not a phone call. A person, in her mother's own living room, with the rank to make the truth feel official rather than incidental. General Ashcombe volunteered to make the trip himself. Vivian sat beside her mother, on the same sofa she'd grown up doing homework on, in the same small house outside a town in central Florida that had never once, in 12 years, stopped smelling faintly of her father's aftershave in the hallway closet nobody had ever cleaned out. Her mother, Louise Sterling, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the posture of a woman who had spent 12 years bracing herself for a version of this conversation she'd assumed would never actually arrive. "Mrs. Sterling," Ashcombe said, his voice gentler than Vivian had ever heard it, "I'm here to tell you the truth about how your husband died. The actual truth. Not the version that was in the file for the last 12 years. Louise's hands tightened in her lap. "I've had 12 years to imagine every version," she said quietly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for the real one." "It's a better one," Vivian said softly. "Mom, it's a better one than the one you've been carrying." Her mother looked at her, and something in her face, tired in a way that had settled so deep it had started to look permanent, shifted, just slightly. Hope is a dangerous thing to offer a person who has spent 12 years training herself not to feel it. Vivian understood that better than almost anyone alive. But she offered it anyway, because for the first time in 12 years, she finally had something real to back it up with. Ashcombe told her, carefully, completely, the system malfunctioned that wasn't a malfunction. The choice her husband made in the final 60 seconds of his life. The recording recovered after 12 years, that proved every word of it. He wasn't scared, Vivian said, when Ashcombe reached that part. His last words were for you. He said, "Tell your mother I wasn't scared. Tell her I chose this." Louise Sterling sat perfectly still for a long moment. Then she made a sound Vivian had never heard her mother make before. Not quite a sob. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting 12 years for permission to finally arrive. "He chose it," she repeated softly. "For you. For me," Vivian said. Her mother reached over and took her hand, the way she used to when Vivian was small enough to still need that particular comfort, and held it the way a person holds something they'd assumed was lost for good. "Then he did exactly what your father always did," she said. "He put you first, every single time, even at the very end." They sat together for a long time after that, the three of them, in a small living room outside a town in central Florida, with the afternoon light coming in low and gold through the windows. And for the first time in 12 years, the story of Marcus Sterling's death finally belonged to the people who had loved him, instead of to a file with a red diagonal stripe on the cover. The formal ceremony took place 2 months later at Castellan Air Force Base, under a sky so clear it looked freshly painted. The Air Force does not often admit it was wrong. When it does, it tries to do so with enough pageantry that the admission feels, at least publicly, like an honor rather than a correction. Vivian had complicated feelings about that particular institutional instinct, but she stood on the tarmac that morning in her dress uniform, beside her mother, beside Holt Ashworth, beside General Ashcombe and Dr. Voss and a dozen pilots who had, over the past several months, quietly become something like a second family, and she let the pageantry happen, because her mother deserved to watch it happen. Because some corrections, even imperfect ones, still matter enormously to the people who waited 12 years for them. They read her father's name, corrected the record, formally in front of witnesses, awarded a posthumous commendation that would never fully capture what he'd actually done, because no piece of paper ever really can, but that at least, finally, told the truth in the direction the truth had always deserved to be told. Vivian's mother cried through most of it. Vivian held her hand the entire time and did not. Afterward, Ashcombe pulled Vivian aside, away from the small crowd still gathered near the tarmac. "There's one more piece of paperwork," he said, and held out a folder. Vivian opened it. Her operational flight status. Restored. Not as an instructor, as an active pilot, with every attendant clearance and designation, retroactively dated to close the 12-year gap the original reassignment had created. Officially, as of this document, she had never truly been grounded at all. The record now said she had simply held an assignment that required her particular expertise. It wasn't fully accurate, but it was far closer to the truth than anything that had existed before it. Vivian looked at her name on the page, at the dates, at the designation, active, operational, unrestricted. She folded the document in half, slid it into the breast pocket of her uniform, over her heart. Not sentimentality, exactly. She simply didn't trust herself to set it down anywhere. It might eventually start feeling ordinary, before she was ready to let it. "Cotter Flats," Ashcombe said. "Voss wants you there full-time within the month. Leading the counter-autonomous program properly this time. Running it." "I know," Vivian said. "Take whoever you need," Ashcombe said. "I've already approved 5 transfer requests off my own desk. Ashworth, Adeyemi, and 3 others who apparently decided watching you fly once was enough to reorganize their entire careers around." Vivian almost smiled. "They're going to need someone who knows how to fly badly on purpose," she said. Ashcombe laughed, short and real. The first time Vivian had heard him laugh in the entire time she'd known him. "Then I suppose it's a good thing you already have practice teaching that particular skill," he said. They left for Cotter Flats 3 weeks later. The facility, in the time since Vivian's first visit, had grown into something closer to what Voss had originally described. New hangars, a proper simulation wing, better than anything Castellan had ever had, with equipment that didn't flicker and didn't lag and didn't remind anyone, every single day, of exactly how long a maintenance request could sit unfixed if nobody with enough rank cared to notice. Vivian's quarters were small, functional. She didn't mind. She had spent 12 years learning to want small things, and even now, with so much restored, some part of that discipline remained, quietly useful, quietly hers. On her first evening there, she walked out past the last hangar, into the open desert beyond the perimeter fence, and stood beneath a sky that held more stars than she had ever seen in Florida. The high desert air was cold, in a way the Gulf Coast never got cold, sharp and clean, and the silence out there was total in a way that felt less like emptiness and more like room to finally breathe. She heard footsteps behind her, didn't need to turn around to know whose they were. Holt stopped a few feet away, stood beside her, looking up at the same sky. "Big program," he said after a while. "Big responsibility. I know. You scared?" Vivian considered the question the way she considered every question that deserved an honest answer instead of a comfortable one. "Every day," she said. Holt nodded slowly, like he'd expected exactly that answer and respected it more for not being softened. "Good," he said. "That's what scared means, right? Somebody told me that once. Means you keep going anyway." Vivian looked over at him. Something in her chest, guarded for 12 years, loosened by a degree she hadn't quite decided to allow yet, but allowed anyway. Smart somebody, she said. She was quiet for a moment. He gave me his jet once, she said. When it mattered. Didn't hesitate. Smart guy too, apparently, Holt said. Vivian almost laughed. The sound surprised her, coming up out of somewhere that had gone unused for longer than she'd realized. They stood together under the enormous New Mexico sky, not touching, not needing to yet. Two people who had each, in their own way, been remade by the same 45 minutes over the Gulf of Mexico months earlier, and who were both quietly, in no particular hurry, learning what came next. I heard Lieutenant Adiemi arrives Thursday, Vivian said eventually. Whole squad's coming, Holt said. You built something people want to be part of. I didn't build it alone. No, Holt agreed, but you're the reason any of us knew it was worth building. Vivian looked up at the stars, thought about her father's voice, 12 years buried, finally heard. Thought about her mother's hand in hers on a sofa in Central Florida. Thought about a cracked watch she still wore, though the crack had stopped feeling like a wound sometime over the past several months, and had started feeling instead like a scar. The kind that proves you survived something, instead of the kind that only proves you were hurt. She thought about Sable, about the truth, finally reaching a family that had waited 12 years for it, delivered the same careful way her own mother's truth had been delivered, because Vivian had made certain, personally, that this time, both promises were kept in full. She thought about the work ahead, the program, the pilots who would train under her, in a desert far from any ocean, learning to do the one thing no machine could ever fully replicate. Not reaction time, not tactical precision. The decision to sacrifice, made freely, completely, without hesitation, in the exact moment it counted most. Her father had given her that lesson, without either of them ever knowing it was a lesson at all. And now she was going to spend the rest of her career passing it forward, the way the best things always get passed forward. Quietly, without asking for credit. From one person who understood the cost to the next person who needed to learn it before the sky demanded to know if they had it in them. The desert wind picked up, cold and clean, carrying nothing but silence and stars, and the distant hum of a facility just beginning to come fully alive. Vivian Sterling stood beneath it, no longer the woman behind the monitors nobody bothered to see, no longer the file marked survived and left at that. She was exactly where she was always supposed to be. And for the first time in 12 years, the sky above her didn't feel like something she'd been hiding from. It felt like something she had finally, completely, come home to.